The year is 1473, before the Common Era. On the western bank of the Nile near Thebes, the sun rises over the desert, painting sand the color of dried blood. A barefoot woman named Hanut Mir stands on limestone so scorching it threatens to raise blisters across her skin. Papyrus fibers bind her hands behind her back so tightly that they have cut into the swollen flesh beneath. Around her neck hangs a wooden sign inscribed with hieroglyphics declaring her transgression, adulteress. In ancient Egypt, this term carried meanings far beyond a simple English translation. It represented a betrayal of Ma'at, the cosmic order that sustained existence and prevented reality from descending into absolute chaos. It meant polluting the bloodlines connecting pharaohs to divine beings. It transformed the woman into an active threat to the universe itself. 3 judges sit sheltered beneath a reed canopy, their faces concealed behind masks carved to resemble Anubis, the jackal deity tasked with weighing human hearts against feathers in the afterlife. They have already delivered their verdict. What follows is not punishment in any modern sense. Instead, it constitutes purification through suffering, a restoration of cosmic balance achieved by systematically destroying the body of someone who dared to disrupt divine order. Hanut Mir is 22 years old. She married a mid-level scribe called Juti 6 years ago. She gave birth to 3 children who vanished from her home 2 days prior, removed by authorities who informed them their mother had succumbed to illness. From the perspective of Egyptian law, this death was already official. The moment accusations proved true, she ceased existing as a person with legal rights, personal identity, or any future beyond servitude. She became nothing more than a demonstration, a living example demonstrating what befalls women who believe their bodies belong to themselves rather than their husbands, their families, and ultimately, the pharaoh. The first punishment assigned to Hanut involves the breaking of the nose. This carries no metaphorical meaning. A priest approaches carrying bronze implements heated in fire until they glow dark red. The intention is not swift death, but permanent marking that will brand her for eternity. In a civilization where the afterlife demands a complete physical body for the soul to return successfully, intentional mutilation carries consequences extending far beyond mortal life into the eternal realm. She attempts to turn away. Temple guards force her into immobility. The priest recites a ritual invocation calling upon Amun-Ra to bear witness that this agony serves divine purposes. Then the heated implements clamp onto her face, and cartilage tears away from bone in a motion witnesses later compare to ripping papyrus, though wetter. The physical pain pales compared to the realization that this represents merely the beginning. The judges have designated 15 days of purification through suffering before her final judgment. During these 15 days, her body will undergo systematic transformation designed to serve as a cautionary tale for every woman in Thebes who might imagine that her personal desires carry more weight than her prescribed obligations. What historical education typically excludes is the systematic brutality that characterized ancient Egypt's treatment of women accused of infidelity. Most people learn about Cleopatra and Nefertiti, celebrated queens commanding influence throughout the ancient world. They encounter discussions of elaborate beauty practices, kohl-lined eyes, and golden ornaments. Museum exhibitions showcase Egyptian civilization's intellectual sophistication, its breakthroughs in medicine, mathematics, and engineering. They absorb the idea that ancient Egypt represented a relatively egalitarian society where women could possess property and terminate marriages. Yet nowhere in conventional education appears information about the specialized brutality inflicted upon wives accused of sexual transgression. Nowhere do people learn about the priests whose entire professional function involved administering torture so extreme that Roman historians 1,000 years later would struggle to accept Egyptian records as authentic. Nowhere emerges the reality of legal frameworks treating women's physical bodies as male property subject to destruction at a husband's pleasure. Egyptian medical documents preserve comprehensive instructions for physicians treating injuries sustained during these punishments, with explicit guidance to maintain victims in states of suffering without permitting complete healing. Accusations of infidelity functioned as political instruments for eliminating inconvenient women, with conviction statistics exceeding 98% regardless of factual guilt. Archaeological excavations have revealed specialized torture chambers built beneath temples carved from solid bedrock, serving both practical and theological purposes. Records indicate that numerous young women selected death over surviving their complete sentences, with burial documentation showing unusual mortality rates in weeks preceding scheduled final dispositions. The foundational principle underlying this system rested upon ma'at, the cosmic balance established at creation. Every human action either sustained or undermined this universal order. Female infidelity belonged among the most severe violations, equivalent in gravity to desecrating sacred tombs or committing parricide, because sexual transgression introduced uncertainty into genealogies connecting living rulers to their divine forebearers. Yet Egyptian adultery law contained particular insidiousness. Legal texts compiled during the Middle Kingdom distinguished between different categories of infidelity based on a wife's social standing and her partner's identity. A woman of noble birth engaging sexually with an enslaved man committed a graver offense than an enslaved woman with a free man, since the violation of social hierarchy compounded the sexual transgression itself. The gravest offense involved any woman engaging sexually with a priest, as this contaminated not merely family descent, but the sacred mediators between humanity and divinity. Proof requirements were remarkably minimal. Legal papyri document convictions resulting from nothing beyond a neighbor's claim of witnessing a woman speaking openly with a man unrelated to her by blood. Tangible physical evidence became unnecessary. 2 male witnesses providing testimony sufficed for conviction, whereas a woman's own testimony carried virtually no weight in such proceedings. She could not speak in her defense. She could not present corroborating witnesses. She could not request reconsideration. Once accused and convicted, she entered a legal classification called the condemned, a category stripping all protections ordinarily provided to enslaved people. Egyptian law treated male sexual conduct entirely differently. A husband could engage sexually with enslaved women, servants, or professional prostitutes without any legal ramification or social penalty. His wife possessed no right to voice objection without risking her own prosecution for insubordination. Yet a woman speaking privately with any unrelated man faced potential accusations of infidelity. Egyptian legal scholars justified this asymmetry through theological reasoning. They maintained that male sexual activities beyond marriage created no danger to Ma'at, since men could not become pregnant. Therefore, no ambiguity threatened lineage. Women's sexual activities outside marriage represented cosmic violations, since any resulting pregnancy would introduce uncertain paternity into family lines that might eventually connect to pharaonic succession. This reasoning seemed so logically sound to Egyptian legal authorities that they never questioned whether the fundamental premise itself had been designed to grant men absolute dominion over women's physical forms while exempting themselves from equivalent restrictions. Punishments divided into 3 distinct categories, each fulfilling specific functions within the broader system. Marking punishments aimed to render infidelity permanently obvious on the victim's body. Suffering punishments intended to purify the condemned through endured agony while providing witnesses, with demonstrations of transgression's consequences. Final punishments terminated the condemned person's mortal existence in methods carrying implications for their eternal spiritual fate. The sophistication with which Egyptian authorities had structured and systematized cruelty reveals something deeply disturbing about humanity's capacity for rationalizing harm when institutional authority provides moral justification. Henut experiences the marking phase. Following the nasal mutilation, both her cheeks receive branding via a copper implement shaped like a damaged heart hieroglyph, heated until glowing white. Yet branding served purposes transcending simple identification. It rendered her transgression permanently apparent to every individual she encountered. It prevented her from relocating to another city and creating a false identity through remarriage. Most crucially, it designated her as subject to public degradation, signaling that any resident might insult or physically harm her without legal repercussion. Egyptian philosophical thought maintained that humiliation could cleanse spirits in ways physical agony alone could not achieve. By making transgression permanently visible, authorities guaranteed that each subsequent human interaction throughout her remaining existence would reinforce her spiritual pollution. She would never escape the judgment moment. Every water reflection, every face she encountered, every child inquiring about her scarred appearance would perpetually remind her of conviction and spiritual unworthiness. Yet marking represented only the initial phase. Hanut moves from the public judgment location to a structure adjoining the Karnak temple. This building appears nowhere in contemporary tourist guides because it was deliberately removed from temple complex maps compiled for modern visitors. It exists 3 levels beneath the primary temple courts, accessible solely through a tunnel descending steeply into solid rock. Egyptians termed it the House of Correction. Modern archaeologists who have examined it simply call it the adultery chambers. The architectural design reveals function with brutal clarity. 15 tiny rooms extend from a central corridor. Each measures approximately 10 feet square, entirely carved from stone, with a single niche for an oil lamp and iron rings embedded in walls at heights corresponding to a standing woman's wrists and ankles. The ceiling reaches only 6 feet, too low for anyone above average height to maintain a fully upright posture, ensuring persistent physical discomfort even without active torment. No windows provide light. Air circulation exists solely through what drifts along the passage. The temperature remains constant year-round, cool enough to make exposed skin uncomfortable, yet insufficiently cold to offer relief from the burning pain of brands and injuries. Women serve their purification sentences in locations like these, where suffering punishments followed protocols specified in legal documents preserved through repeated copying across generations for judicial training purposes. The standard adultery purification lasted 15 days, divided into 3 5-day intervals, each escalating in severity. The initial 5 days emphasized hunger purification. The convicted woman received water exclusively, with absolutely no food consumption. This constituted not simple starvation, but deliberately calculated nutritional deprivation. She received precisely calculated quantities of water to prevent death from dehydration, amounts carefully measured by priests trained in maintaining bodies in states of suffering. The starvation served theological purposes. Egyptian medical texts explained that digestive organs connected to reproductive organs through passages transmitting vital essences throughout the entire body. Starving the digestive system purportedly purified the reproductive system, burning away spiritual contamination that infidelity had introduced. Yet practical considerations existed alongside theological justifications. Modern medical understanding recognizes that starvation produces psychological transformations that render victims more compliant for subsequent punishments. After 5 days without nutrition, a person's resistance to agony and capacity for rebellion diminish substantially. Blood glucose crashes generate cognitive confusion and muscular weakness. The body initiates consuming its own muscle tissue. Mental processing becomes impaired. While Egyptian authorities may not have comprehended the biochemistry underlying these processes, they recognized the pattern through observation. A woman weakened by hunger presented less resistance, manifested reduced inclination to oppose, expressed greater willingness to endure whatever came next. Days 6 through 10 introduced pain purification. This interval varied depending on the specific circumstances of the alleged affair and the social standing of those implicated. For women like Hanut, wives of moderate status men supposedly caught with comparably ranked partners, the customary pain purification involved repeated striking of the back and legs with reeds. This sounds almost gentle when compared with other historical punishments until one understands the technique's actual application. Egyptian pain purification depended not on raw force, but on cumulative damage delivered with medical precision. Reed strikes were administered 3 times daily, 20 repetitions per session, delivered by a specialized priest who had spent years mastering the necessary force, sufficient to cause severe agony and muscle destruction without fracturing bones or inducing immediate death through internal hemorrhage. The same anatomical regions were struck repeatedly across days, preventing healing and generating successive layers of damaged tissue that medical professionals understood would never fully recover. Medical papyri from Thebes document guidance for physicians treating women who endured reed purification, noting they typically developed chronic pain conditions persisting for years that commonly impaired normal mobility. The instructions specifically note that physicians should address infections threatening death, but should avoid providing treatment that would restore complete tissue integrity. The scarring was designed to be permanent, serving as ongoing physical reminders that would produce pain throughout the woman's remaining existence with each movement. Days 11 through 15 encompassed exposure purification. This terminal interval preceding final judgment required the convicted woman's public display in the temple courtyard throughout the day's most intense heat. She remained bound to a wooden frame positioned directly in the sun, her mutilated face and branded cheeks plainly visible to any individual entering the temple grounds. Guards prevented her from seeking shade. Priests administered water at unpredictable intervals, sometimes hourly, sometimes with 6-hour gaps, generating uncertainty that prevented psychological preparation for hydration or continued suffering. The objective extended beyond simple physical agony, from temperature and thirst to deliberate psychological deterioration through uncertainty and communal degradation. Temple records show that exposure purification frequently constituted the interval where women experienced complete psychological collapse, accepting whatever final judgment awaited simply because continued existence had become agonizing. Throughout these 5 days, some women attempted convincing passing priests or officials of their actual innocence, requesting mercy or case review. Egyptian law prohibited such appeals, though hope dies gradually even under these circumstances. Most pleading met disregard. Occasionally a priest would pause to explain to the begging woman that her agony served cosmic righteousness, that Ma'at necessitated her purification, that her torment was cosmically essential. These explanations constituted not cruelty for personal gratification, but reflected sincere Egyptian theological conviction. The priests administering these torments, who beat women with reeds and withheld shade, and offered these theological justifications, genuinely believed themselves to be performing sacred service. This makes their actions substantially more disturbing, not less. Cruelty rationalized through theology becomes cruelty that can perpetuate without limit through time, justified as righteous duty rather than recognized as the systematic torture it genuinely was. Before explaining the final punishments that determined what occurred to women like Hanut following her 15 days of suffering, it becomes necessary to establish who these women actually were, because historical sources have been fundamentally corrupted by being recorded exclusively by the authorities who tortured them. We must reclaim as thoroughly as possible the human reality beneath legal classifications. The women convicted of infidelity in ancient Egypt were not uniformly guilty by contemporary standards, nor even by rigorous ancient standards. Egyptian marriage customs provide crucial perspective. Girls typically faced marriage at ages 12 or 13 to men their fathers selected, frequently men 20 or 30 years their senior. These arrangements constituted property exchanges. The girl's consent became irrelevant. Following marriage, she became her husband's legal possession with fewer rights than he possessed over his enslaved individuals. Certain women convicted of infidelity had formed genuine connections with men beyond their marriages, relationships frequently grounded in authentic affection, standing in stark contrast to their arranged pairings. Yet countless others faced conviction on evidence that contemporary legal standards would regard as absurdly inadequate, conversing with an unrelated man at a marketplace, walking solo near a neighbor's residence, singing audibly while performing labor that an unrelated man might overhear. Egyptian tribunal records from the 19th dynasty document convictions resulting from behaviors that included zero physical contact and no private interaction. Convictions resulting solely because male witnesses testified that the woman's conduct had appeared seductive to them. The operative legal standard was not whether she actually engaged in infidelity, but whether she created circumstance or appearance permitting potential infidelity. Women convicted of merely appearing to create such circumstances received identical punishments as women apprehended in actual affairs. Numerous convictions originated from deliberately fabricated accusations driven by motivations entirely unconnected to genuine sexual conduct. A husband, desiring to terminate his marriage without returning her financial settlement, could accuse her of infidelity, providing his enslaved individuals as testimony, securing both marital dissolution and property retention. A neighbor, coveting her residence or possessions, could denounce her, recognizing that conviction would trigger property confiscation that might advantage the informant. A man whose romantic advances she had declined could claim the woman had pledged herself to him before betraying him with her actual husband, reframing legitimate marriage as infidelity through inventive testimony. Comprehending this context proves essential because it demonstrates we are not simply examining ancient perspectives on sexual ethics. We are examining how legal systems can be engineered to grant institutional legitimacy to systematized male violence against women, how theological frameworks can repackage brutality as righteousness, how entire civilizations can convince themselves that systematic cruelty constitutes justice. The dispositions terminating purification sentences determined what occurred to women's physical forms and eternal spirits. Egyptian jurisprudence recognized three categories of terminal judgment appropriate to various circumstances. The first, and supposedly least severe, was permanent temple servitude. Women assigned this punishment transferred from the house of correction to temple complexes where they performed the lowest category of labor. They cleaned floors, disposed of refuse, prepared corpses for mummification, and executed any task that Egyptian sensibilities deemed spiritually polluting. They inhabited windowless chambers attached to temple storage areas. They could not communicate beyond direct responses to priest instructions. They never departed temple grounds or maintained family connection. Their heads remained perpetually shaved. Their branded adultery marks underwent annual refreshing to prevent fading. They wore gray linen, a hue signifying death and bereavement, rather than white linen worn by respectable women. Most critically, they became forbidden from participating in religious ceremonies that prepared Egyptians for the afterlife. They could not commission mortuary writings. They could not acquire burial jars or secure grave space. Upon death, their bodies underwent no mummification, but received simple wrapping in plain linen and burial in unmarked desert graves beyond temple grounds. Egyptian theology held that without appropriate burial preparation, the soul could not successfully complete the afterlife journey and would instead perpetually wander the void outside Ma'at. This constituted not merely lifetime punishment, but eternal punishment. The woman faced consequences not only for years but perpetually across all eternity itself. Temple records indicate that roughly 40% of convicted adulteresses received this sentence. Typical survival in temple servitude lasted 7 years, with most deaths resulting from untreated infections, dangerous labor accidents, or simple surrender through starvation. The second terminal judgment category was exile to the mines. Egypt's gold and copper mining operations in the eastern desert and Sinai employed convicted criminals as labor. These assignments constituted not prison work in any contemporary sense, but death sentences with preliminary stages. Women exiled to the mines faced chaining in groups of 12 and forced marching across desert terrain to mining camps controlled by military commanders. The march alone killed roughly 30% of those assigned, with remains abandoned where bodies collapsed without arrangements for interment. Those surviving the journey entered conditions that render contemporary slavery descriptions inadequate. The mines were deep passages carved through rock, barely wide enough for bodies to proceed sideways, routinely reaching temperatures exceeding 130 degrees. Workers operated completely nude because fabric disintegrated from perspiration and heat within days. They received water twice daily, morning and evening, perpetually insufficient quantities that created constant, partial dehydration, preventing clear thought. Food consisted of barley paste, provided in amounts designed to maintain bodies in functioning condition while maintaining constant weakness. The labor itself required crawling through passages too confined for standing, striking rock faces with bronze implements in darkness broken solely by sporadic oil lamps, producing more smoke than illumination. The heat was so extreme that workers' skin suffered burns from contact with stone surfaces. The air was so saturated with dust that every inhalation scraped at lung tissue. Women labored until collapsing from temperature extremes, trauma, or exhaustion. Upon collapse, they were dragged from the tunnels and left exposed to sunlight. If they recovered sufficiently to resume work, they returned to the mines. If recovery proved impossible, within 3 days, they received burial in mass graves near mining camps. Egyptian records do not document individual women's survival durations in mine exile, yet archaeological examinations of mining camp burial grounds reveal skeletal remains exhibiting signs of severe physical trauma, malnutrition, and deaths, typically occurring approximately 18 months following arrival. Roughly 30% of convicted adulteresses received mine exile sentences. The selection between mines and temple servitude depended partly on labor requirements. Mines required continuous worker replacement, since mortality rates outpaced conventional criminal sentencing capability. Yet it also reflected the specific affair characteristics. Women who had engaged sexually with significantly lower status men faced higher mine exile probability, as did women who demonstrated defiance during suffering intervals or who attempted escape. The third and terminal judgment classification involved public execution. This applied to the most severe circumstances involving high-status women committing infidelity with partners generating particular scandal or political complications. Egyptian executions for infidelity followed established protocols, fulfilling both practical and theological objectives. The woman did not merely die, but died in methods preventing her the soul's mobile component, from reuniting with her the soul's vital force, in the afterlife. This necessitated destroying the physical form so thoroughly that reconstruction became impossible, even through divine intervention. The standard execution method for high-status adulteresses was submersion in the Nile while bound in weighted sacks. This technique achieved multiple simultaneous purposes with characteristic Egyptian efficiency. The Nile held sacred significance, and Hapi, the river deity, was considered to judge those placed into its waters. If the sack descended rapidly, Hapi had apparently accepted the execution as justified. The weighted sack prevented the body from drifting downriver, where recovery and burial preparation might become possible. And submersion was considered uniquely suitable for adulteresses, because water filling the lungs, the organs Egyptians associated with respiration and spiritual essence, would prevent the from breathing in the afterlife. Executions constituted public spectacles conducted at dawn from boats anchored in central river channels where currents ran strongest. The condemned woman was sewn into a linen sack filled with stones sufficiently heavy to overcome the body's natural buoyancy. Prior to sealing the sack, a priest recited a formula stating that the woman had violated Ma'at and was returning to the cosmic void. Subsequently, the sack was thrown overboard while crowds observed from both riverbanks. Records from execution. Witnesses described the sack sinking immediately and completely disappearing beneath the surface within moments, pulled downward by combined weight and water current. The descriptions include specifics suggesting certain women retained consciousness and struggled as the sack was being sealed. The movements visible through the linen as the sack submerged. The bubbles ascending to the surface for extended minutes following submersion. The terrible knowledge that someone was dying gradually in darkness and liquid while crowds watched from shore, powerless to hear screams muffled by linen and river noise. Roughly 30% of convicted adulteresses underwent drowning execution. Execution selection versus temple servitude or mine exile typically reflected the prominence of involved parties and the political necessity of creating particularly visible demonstration. Women whose affairs had become widespread knowledge, whose partners themselves held influence, or whose family members possessed enemies seeking vengeance through public scandal, faced higher execution probability rather than receiving extended hidden punishments that maintained them alive, but concealed. To comprehend how these systems functioned in actual practice and how they destroyed not merely individual women, but entire families, consider Hanut Mir, the woman encountered at the beginning of this account. Hanut's conviction originated from testimony provided by her husband Juti's younger sibling, a man named Amenhotep, who had himself repeatedly attempted romantic overtures toward Hanut across the preceding 2 years, and faced rejection each time. Before the judges, Amenhotep testified that he personally witnessed Hanut in intimate embrace with a potter called Nak, describing particular dates, times, and specific activities supposedly performed. He presented a servant claiming to have facilitated private communications between Hanut and Nak. He produced a pottery fragment containing a love composition scratched into its surface, asserting he discovered it concealed in Hanut's clothing storage. The testimony was entirely false. The meetings Amenhotep described never transpired. The servant received beatings until consenting to provide whatever narrative Amenhotep demanded. The pottery fragment containing love verse Amenhotep had personally created, duplicating composition overheard at a social gathering. Yet Egyptian jurisprudence recognized physical evidence combined with declarations from 2 male witnesses as sufficient for conviction regardless of truthfulness. Hanut received no permission to testify in her personal defense. Nak never received summons as a witness and actually learned of the accusation solely following Hanut's conviction when he himself underwent arrest and swift execution for infidelity with a married woman. His death came via single sword stroke, terminating him in moments. The disparity in how male and female infidelity receive treatment appears starkly in this case. Nak, judged culpable of identical transgression, died without pain. Hanut endured 15 days of systematic torture followed by years of bondage. Juti remained unaware of his brother's fabricated accusation until Hanut underwent arrest. Upon learning what Amenhotep engineered, he attempted to retract the accusation and provide testimony to Hanut's innocence. Yet Egyptian legal procedure prohibited accusation withdrawal once formal charges received filing. The judges explained to Juti that enabling withdrawals would incentivize false accusations by diminishing consequences for dishonest testimony, and that maintaining legal system credibility required prosecuting accusations to completion once formally initiated. Furthermore, Juti's testimony concerning Hanut's innocence was deemed inadmissible because as her husband, he possessed conflict of interest, making his account unreliable according to legal standards. The legal apparatus had attained perfect circularity. An accused wife could not defend herself because her account held no weight. Her husband could not defend her because his account held no weight. No evidence beyond accusation proved necessary, and following accusation, no retraction became permissible. Hanut completed her 15-day suffering interval beneath Karnak Temple. Her nasal structures underwent destruction. Her facial skin received branding. Her posterior and legs endured beating until ambulation became agonizing. She stood in sunlight pleading for mercy that never arrived. Subsequently, she received assignment to permanent temple servitude. Throughout 9 consecutive years, she existed in a windowless chamber performing defiling labor, witnessing other condemned women arrive, suffer, expire in surrounding cells. Her offspring matured believing she had succumbed when they were small. Their father remarried 3 years following Hanut's conviction, selecting a significantly younger spouse recommended by his brother, Amenhotep, who had engineered the complete false accusation to generate room for a woman he preferred in the family structure. The offspring received upbringing by their replacement mother and received instruction never to speak their biological mother's name. Within a decade, the younger ones had forgotten her appearance. The eldest retained fragmentary memory of a woman who had sung while grinding grain, though those reminiscences faded progressively until they felt like dream experiences rather than genuine moments. Hanut expired in her 31st year. Her remains appeared in the temple's refuse disposal space, where she had deteriorated while carrying human waste for disposal. Temple records documented her cause as cardiac failure, which physicians used to categorize any death they could not specifically classify. She received wrapping in plain linen and burial in an unmarked desert grave beyond temple grounds. No spiritual ritual occurred, no mortuary literature was commissioned, no blessing was offered for her spiritual transition. Her designation fails to surface in family genealogies. Her entire existence was erased so thoroughly that we know of her exclusively because her husband Juti preserved a document after her conviction that was duplicated in an archive of contested legal scenarios. Juti's document contended that legal procedures required modification to prevent false accusations from annihilating innocent women. His proposals underwent examination by temple authorities and received rejection. The dismissal explained that preventing false convictions mattered less than guaranteeing actual adulteresses could not evade punishment, and that legal procedures must emphasize punishment certainty above conviction accuracy. This reasoning appeared repeatedly throughout Egyptian legal philosophy. The apparatus was deliberately constructed to apprehend all probable guilty individuals, even if that meant condemning substantial proportions of innocent women. The acceptable error margin received no specification because Egyptian legal thought maintained that divine justice would amend any mortal mistakes in the afterlife, where truly innocent parties would obtain vindication and genuinely culpable individuals would face damnation. Yet Henud's account, tragic as it appears, represents merely one destruction pattern. Consider women at opposite positions on the social hierarchy. Elite women and royal family members whose high rank made their punishments simultaneously more extreme and more politically influential. In 1318, before the Common Era, a woman designated Tawazret underwent adultery accusations that would fundamentally alter Egyptian dynastic authority for subsequent decades. She functioned as the principal spouse of Pharaoh Seti II, a woman of royal descent herself, descended from the influential 19th dynasty commanding Egypt for nearly 100 years. Tawazret had functioned as administrator throughout her husband's medical condition, essentially directing Egypt across 2 years, while Seti lay debilitated by what physicians identified as the wasting affliction, potentially malignancy. She had overseen the kingdom competently, preserving diplomatic relations with Hittite partners, directing grain distribution throughout unfavorable Nile inundation periods, and mediating a territorial conflict with Libyan populations. She exhibited administrative ability surpassing numerous male pharaohs throughout Egyptian history. She comprehended trade networks, military administration, religious authority, and agrarian systems. She was by any objective measure qualified to direct the civilization. Yet her exercise of governmental authority alarmed influential religious authorities and aristocrats, convinced that women governing, even temporarily, disrupted natural hierarchy. Upon Seti's passing, his designated inheritor was a youthful progeny from a secondary spouse, a child approximately 9 years old labeled Sipa. Tawazret should logically have become administrator for the juvenile pharaoh, perpetuating her governance until Sipa attained sufficient maturity. Yet the authority coalition opposing female governance required a mechanism to eliminate her that maintained appearance of legitimacy rather than naked political removal. An adultery accusation provided the solution. A judicial officer designated Bey testified that he had personally seen Tawazret in intimate physical contact with a Syrian functionary identified as Ersu. Bey furnished detailed depiction of what he asserted observing, specifying place, temporal reference, and particular activities supposedly occurring. He presented an attendant asserting to have readied sleeping quarters for Tawazret's meetings with Ersu. He introduced ornamentation, asserting Tawazret had transferred to Ersu as emotional tokens. The accusation was politically inspired because refutation became impossible. Tawazret's administrative role obligated her to engage regularly with all senior administrators, including Ersu. She had genuinely distributed gifts to administrators functioning effectively, adhering to established authority protocols for compensating productive labor. She had certainly maintained private conferences with her representative on numerous instances to manage administrative functions, as any leader necessarily engages with senior personnel. All circumstantial proof Bey presented contained factual accuracy. He had simply reinterpreted genuine administrative operation as romantic affair via the accusation framework. Tawazret underwent arrest, received trial before a specialized theological court, and obtained conviction according to Bay's assertions despite her steadfast insistence that her ERSU interactions remained purely governmental. The governmental complications of correcting a queen necessitated inventive adaptation of customary adultery mechanisms. Tawazret could not undergo temple servitude or mine exile because her royal standing generated theological complications with such dispositions. She could not face public execution because executing someone retaining royal status might destabilize the dynasty itself. Authorities consequently created a punishment satisfying both governmental requisites and theological necessities. Tawazret underwent imprisonment in a sealed burial chamber alive. This punishment derived from Egyptian spiritual customs, though perverted into nightmare. A chamber designated for her upcoming burial underwent premature completion. Tawazret underwent transport there, received 1 week of provisions and liquid, and remained sealed within with workers plastering the aperture and depicting her supposed transgressions alongside customary spiritual texts. Egyptian theology taught that chamber sealing commenced spiritual journey. Sealing a living person in a burial chamber generated theological uncertainty serving political functions. Did existence continue or had it ended? Did mortal regulation persist or had spiritual judgment begun? The answer remained deliberately undefined. Such ambiguity enabled Tawazret to vanish without generating clear legal framework that might endanger additional royal women. Tawazret persisted in her chamber for extended months, creating communications using damaged pottery fragments. Those communications, discovered upon later reopening, chronicle her psychological disintegration as supplies depleted, darkness became complete, and air grew insufficient. As comprehension emerged that liberation would not come, her final communications oscillated between assertions of innocence and acceptance of demise. Her ultimate carved statement reads that the Syrian never touched her, yet Egypt consumed her, that they name it justice though divinities perceive truthfulness. She perished from liquid deprivation or hunger. Her remains eventually underwent natural mummification in the desiccated chamber setting. Upon the chamber's eventual official reopening throughout broader spiritual transformation periods, her mummified form was retrieved and reburied in an unmarked location. Her nomenclature was obliterated from monuments. Her regulatory period underwent attribution to male administrators in formal chronicles. Throughout 3,000 years, Tawazret persisted merely as a subordinate reference in succession documentation. A female figure briefly positioned between two male rulers. Exclusively in contemporary centuries did scholarly investigation and document translation unveil her genuine account, and the infidelity accusation, obliterating her. The systematic obliteration apparent in Tawazret's destruction manifests repeatedly examining how adultery accusations operated as governmental apparatus for extracting powerful women from authority. The legal structure and punishment mechanisms produced enduring prototypes affecting Mediterranean legal customs for millennia. Yet returning to everyday existence reveals how these mechanisms touched ordinary existence. Because for every Tawazret destroyed by high authority scheming, thousands of females like Henut experienced ruin through mundane brutality of husbands, relatives, and legal frameworks, treating women as forms, as communal assets requiring communal governance. A woman designated Mutnofret, age 17, underwent adultery conviction approximately 1200 before common periods in Memphis. Her narrative reaches us via an extraordinary document, a plea for understanding submitted by her maternal figure Nephitis, presented to magistrates following Mutnofret's conviction, though preceding her terminal judgment categorization. The petition continued existing because it underwent duplication as instruction for clerical education, mastering legal composition. According to the plea, Mutnofret married at 13 years to a ceramicist identified as Kaimet, age 37. The matrimony underwent arrangement by Mutnofret's paternal figure, who had incurred financial obligations to Kaimet and discharged them by transferring his offspring as matrimonial companion. Kaimet maintained Memphis' reputation as a brutal individual. He had previously married, yet his initial spouse expired under conditions neighbors doubted involved maltreatment, although charges never materialized because a man correcting his spouse through violence operated within legal bounds. Mutnofret's matrimonial existence proved brutal from commencement. Kaimet administered repeated beatings, frequently with sufficient severity that neighboring individuals could perceive, her agonies penetrating hardened mud barriers. He compelled her to operate in his pottery production without compensation, despite Egyptian statute requiring husbands to furnish wives with individual resources. He prevented her from visiting her birth family or maintaining any genetic kinship connection, completely isolating her within his residence where nobody could perceive the complete brutality of his conduct. Upon achieving pregnancy at 16, Kaimet denounced her of infidelity, asserting the offspring could not be his progeny because he had not maintained intimate relations with her throughout the relevant interval. The declaration was irrational. Physician assessment confirmed Mutnofret's gravidity and approximated she carried the pregnancy approximately 4 lunar cycles. For Kaimet's proposition to contain factuality, some unidentified male would have required opportunity to conceive her whilst she remained in complete seclusion inside Kaimet's dwelling, with opportunity to neither depart nor accommodate guests without his authorization. Yet rationality held no relevance within Egyptian adultery legal systems. Kaimet submitted official allegations testifying that Mutnofret obviously engaged sexually with some unidentified individual, given her gravidity and his certitude regarding his own abstention. Mutnofret delivered testimony that Kaimet had certainly engaged sexually with her on numerous instances throughout the applicable interim, that he definitely constituted the progenitor, and that his assertions came from aspiration to eliminate a matrimonial partner without returning her financial dowry or confronting public judgment for his brutality.